This is a philosophical account of agency in an entropic universe. So it's a long-form exploration of agentic negentropic dynamics, or what we call AND. So the introduction here is, what does it mean to be an agent? What does it mean to be something that acts, that plans, that desires, and that maintains itself as a coherent whole in a world that constantly threatens to dissolve it into chaos? This question, which has really haunted philosophy since its inception, the question has typically been pursued through the foggy lenses of introspection, linguistic analysis, like the study of living things in their messy particularity. But what follows here is an attempt to describe agency in a different way, not as just some mystical spark, not as just a purely computational trick, but as a universal pattern of order maintenance that emerges whenever certain physical and informational conditions converge. So the AND framework that we're going to explore, it proposes that to be an agent is, at the most fundamental level, it's to be a process that swims upstream against the river of entropy, and it uses information as a rudder, and it uses energy as a motor. And it does that under strict constraints that shape everything from the quick flow of subjective time to the slow accumulation of wisdom. We're going to call it wisdom. And it's a view that treats belief not as some kind of hand-wavy shadow of the world, but as a physical configuration that costs real energy to maintain. And it sees memory not as a static storehouse, but as a substrate, a slowly changing substrate that gives identity its weight, and that understands complexity not as a slogan, but as a measurable quality. Complexity is a quality that actually bends the parameters that an agent operates upon. In other words, this is a metaphysics for the age of thermodynamics and information theory, really. But it's one that remains deeply human in its implications, because it actually offers us a new lens, a new way to think about what it means to live well, what it means to know truly, what it means to persist meaningfully in a universe that would otherwise just instantly forget us. So we're going to cover, first of all, ontology, then we're going to talk about the epistemology of agentic negentropic dynamics, then axiology, or the ethics of it, and then finally the metaphysics of it, the deep questions that it can uncover. We're going to then talk about practical implications of this framework, and finally we have some references, or like a library of affinities from different thinkers, and a reinterpretation of them through the agentic negentropic dynamics. And then of course we're going to start, like I said, with ontology, the furniture of the agentic world. When we ask about ontology, we're actually asking what sort of things there are. What categories of beings actually populate reality. Negentropics, our framework, it proposes that the world of agency is not divided into traditional Cartesian substances, like mind and matter, res cogitans or res extensa. The world is actually divided into a more fluid and more interdependent set of processes, and each process has its own mode of existence, but each of them are sort of tethered to the others, and there are physical laws that are sort of unbreakable connections between these elements of agency. So the first component is order itself. This is what the framework calls S. It's a variable. It's a measure of negentropy. So how far a system has managed to pull itself away from the featureless equilibrium of the universe's natural entropy. It's where the universe is headed to, is cold and dead, dissipated. So order, or S, in the framework, it's not a static property, but it's a dynamic achievement. Think of it that way. Think of a flame that has to be continuously fed. It exists in degrees. Its maintenance is the central task of any agent. So an agent in this view is not defined by having a particular material substrate, like carbon or silicon or something. It's defined by being a region of space-time in which order is actively, systematically, and resourcefully defended. Order is defended against the constant pull of dissipation. So again, a candle flame is an agent in this minimal sense because it's fighting against its own dissipation. It's using energy and it's using resources in order to do that. A living cell is an agent. A brain is an agent. A carefully thermostated data center could be an agent by this definition. So what is it that unifies them all? It's not what they're made of, it's what they do. They hold form against the void. So first of all, there's order. Now secondly, a second ontological element here is information. But this is not the abstract, sort of disembodied information that philosophers imagine sometimes. In our case, information is always physical. It's encoded inside states. It's carried by signals. It's processed by mechanisms that obey the laws of thermodynamics. So every bit of information has a cost. It's a Landauer energy. It's the minimum amount of work that must be expended in order to erase or to maintain the information itself, the bit. It's a bitwise measure. Now, belief, in this ontology anyway, it's a particular distribution of information. It has a shape in a possibility space that represents what the agent takes to be likely, to be plausible, or what the agent thinks is useful about its world. The belief is not just some private mental image. It's an actual configuration of the agent's physical degrees of freedom. It's a pattern that can be measured, actually. It can be measured, in principle anyway, by an outside observer that exerts causal influence on the agent's behavior. So the belief certainly exerts causal influence. So to believe something is quite literally to be configured in a certain way, and that configuration is expensive. Again, it has a thermodynamic profile. Now the third element, after order and information, is going to be energy. We can be more precise in calling it actually power, the rate at which work can be done. Now energy is the currency of agency. So it like any currency, it has to be budgeted, it has to be allocated and spent wisely. Because an agent without energy is an agent that can no longer maintain its own order, and it can't update its beliefs, it can no longer act. Our Agentic Negentropic dynamics framework, it's insisting that there's no such thing as a free lunch for an agent. Every prediction, every memory update, every moment of introspection is going to cost power for that agent, and it must be budgeted. That's a hard constraint. It's not a metaphor. So the power budget is a fundamental ontological fact about any agent, and it's as real as the mass of the agent or the charge of the agent. This is sort of a strong chain that tethers, I guess, the ghost of intelligence to the machine of the world, energy or power. Now the fourth ontological component of an agentive world is time. But time here has a double form in A and D. And this double form is important for us to understand agency because, first of all, there is a physical time. It's the universal clock that ticks forward relentlessly, and it's the same cadence everywhere you go. It's the same for everything. But there is a second track. It's subjective time, which is it's not just some kind of qualia, like some mystical private experiential thing. It's actually a rate at which the agent processes its own existence. Subjective time is going to speed up when the agent is aroused. It's going to process its loop faster. When prediction errors are high, it speeds up. When the world demands attention, you have faster processing. But your subjective time is going to slow down when things are routine, when things are predictable, when things are safe. So it's not just a metaphor about how time feels. It's an actual algorithmic claim about the operational tempo of the agent's internal processes. This tempo can be measured through proxies like pupil dilation, heart rate, variability, the power spectrum of your neural activity. It's all measurable. But the agent lives at the speed that it's tuned to its own informational and metabolic state. Right? Think of a fly at the fast metabolic state and a turtle at a slow metabolic state, for example. There is a felt time, or a proper time for an agent. So two temporal tracks, right? Physical time and then subjective time. Now the fifth thing, of course, is you're going to have memory as an ontological substrate. But again, memory here is not just a recording device alone. Memory is going to be a slow variable. It's a change strata. It's a substrate. It changes at a much more gradual tempo than the immediate flux of perception and action. Like, things happen fast at the surface level. With memory, things happen slowly. And memory gives the agent its identity over time. It gives its agent a capacity to learn from the past without being constantly rewritten. Think of memory like the sediment that accumulates while the river of consciousness flows. So ontologically, then, memory is a kind of crystallized order, like a repository of valuable patterns that have been distilled from the noise of experience. And memory has a great energetic cost, actually. So the framework insists that writing to memory is subject to the Landauer bound, because to remember is to expend energy, and to forget is to release it as heat. So memory itself is a great thermodynamic topic, an important thermodynamic challenge. Okay, sixth of all, there's this concept of complexity, or C, in the framework. Complexity is important. It's a quality that runs from simple, obviously, right, to complex, to super complex, to all the way to be unruly. And so an agent of low complexity is like a thermostat. It has a very clear job. It has very fixed parameters. It has very predictable behavior. But an agent of high complexity is going to be like a human in a new situation, maybe. The parameters are constantly readjusting. Its horizons are short. Its resistance to disorder is high, but it's actually pretty fragile. So complexity is not some kind of binary property. Complexity is a spectrum, and complexity renormalizes the very underlying rules by which the agent actually operates, because a complex agent is not just a simple agent with more parts. It's an agent whose internal dynamics are qualitatively different. They're more sensitive. A complex agent's dynamics are more sensitive, more costly. They're more prone to catastrophic failure, but they're also capable of much, what would you call it, richer feats of adaptation. Now the seventh, and pretty subtle actually, is what we're calling spectral modes. These are internal rhythms and oscillations that characterize an agent's operational state. Internally, an agent is complex. There are many moving parts. And these are sort of the frequencies at which an agent would hum. They're neural oscillations, for example, of a brain, or metabolic cycles of a cell, or the clock speeds of a processor. And these modes have their own housekeeping costs. They're going to maintain certain rhythms, and they're going to dissipate energy. As you try to maintain a rhythm, you're going to dissipate energy. So an agent, then, can either be in sync with itself or out of sync. In sync with itself. It's going to have internal frequencies that are harmonized. And when it does, it's going to pay a different energetic price than one that has dissonant or chaotic frequencies. The modes are not just byproducts of activity. They're actually constitutive of the activity. If you think of Kuramoto oscillations, it's the same real mathematics that determines the ratio of the teeth on the gears in your watch so that they harmonize, or the flashing of fireflies in some kind of sequence in a field at night, or brain waves are also governed by Kuramoto oscillations. But maybe even more interestingly, so is music. They're the music that the agent makes while it works, basically. Now finally, there is really important this what we call counterfactual divergence. So this is a measure of the agent's capacity to entertain alternatives. And ontologically, this is ground for choice. It's the ability to simulate. Even crudely, it's the ability to simulate what would happen if one acted differently. This is the space of what if. It separates agency from just mere reflex. This divergence is a real physical quantity. It's the distance measured in information terms between the prediction distribution that the agent actually uses and the one it would have used if it had followed a different policy. To have agency means to inhabit this kind of divergence. It's to be able to feel the pull of paths that you have not taken and compare them to the path that you did take, what resolved against what could have resolved. This ontology is pluralistic. It's a processual ontology. It doesn't reduce everything just to matter, and it doesn't elevate information to some kind of mystic realm. Instead, it offers sort of a tapestry of interdependent categories. You've got order, you've got information, then there's energy, then there's time. You've got memory, you've got complexity, you've got rhythm, and you've got possibility. So to be an agent is to be like a knot in this tapestry. It's a region where these threads pull tightly together and they hold a shape against entropy. So with ontology out of the way, let's discuss epistemology. It's how do agents come to know. And if ontology tells us what there is, epistemology tells us how we can know what there is. The framework, Agentic Negentropics, epistemology is pretty radical departure from both classical rationalism and naive empiricism. It's not a theory of how disembodied minds grasp eternal truths. Okay? And it's also not a story of how blank slates are inscribed by sensations. What this theory is instead is it's a theory of active predictive knowing. It's a knowing that's always partial because, well, yeah, it's always provisional. It's always costly. It's always tied to the practical demands of staying alive and staying ordered. So central to this epistemology is the concept of predictive information. Because an agent knows its world not by building a perfect mirror of it, but by continuously generating predictions about what will happen next, and then using the errors in those predictions to update its own beliefs, its own memories. So knowledge is not just a static picture, it's like a running model. It's a dynamic simulation that is only as good as its last prediction was. So the agent's world is the horizon of its own expectations, and the world around its resistance to those expectations, the surprise, the error, the entropy. It's the very engine of learning. So to know is to bet, and to learn is to adjust the odds on your bets. And this predictive knowing, it's informationally bounded. So because an agent cannot know everything, because it can't process everything, it has a channel capacity, and this is a hard limit on the rate at which an agent can receive and act on any information. So this is not a temporary limitation that better technology is going to overcome. This is a epistemological principle. So the world is always richer than the agent's capacity to take in everything, and the gap is not a bug. It's actually a feature of agency in a world that's bigger than it is. So this reality forces the agent to be selective. We have to prioritize, we have to filter. And attention then is not some kind of mysterious mental power. Attention is the necessary consequence of finite information bandwidth. Think of it that way. And to attend then, to pay attention, is to allocate capacity. And capacity is always scarce in a big world. Okay, what about belief? In this epistemology, belief is a distribution of probability across possible states of the world. The agent does not believe that X is true in some absolute sense, so that we're not saying belief in some kind of dogmatic absolution. An agent believes that X is more or less likely, and it updates this likelihood continuously. This is like new evidence, prediction errors. New evidence arrives in the form of prediction errors. So the belief is encoded physically. It's in the configuration of the agent's internal states, and belief is subject to variational principle then. So the agent acts as if it's trying to minimize a kind of free energy, a sum of the cost of being surprised and the cost of maintaining its internal order, so Friston free energy. And this is not a normative claim about what agents should do. It's a descriptive claim about what any system that persists as an agent must do. Because to survive is to keep one's free energy low enough that order does not flicker out, that, the tenuous negentropic state space that the agent is maintaining does not get overrun by entropy. So the framework is also going to introduce another powerful epistemological tool called what we call counterfactual divergence. This is going to be the measure of an agent's ability to distinguish between the policy it is following and the policies it could be following. So in traditional epistemology, this is the space of deliberation and choice. In this framework, it's a measurable quantity. The informational distance between the predictive consequence of different courses of action. It's a measurable distance. And the agent that can't entertain counterfactuals, it can't simulate what if I did otherwise questions. It can't imagine, it can't compare. So this is not an agent, but it's just an automation then. It has no freedom. It has no freedom of choice. So on the other hand, an agent with high counterfactual divergence is one that can hold multiple futures in its mind. It can feel their compelling pulls, and it can select among these counterfactuals. So this capacity is the epistemological basis of agency, actually. It's important. It's the sense that one's actions are truly one's own. It's also the basis of what we call phenomenal intensity. This is the feeling of vividness that accompanies any high-stake moments or any high uncertainty, right? When you're uncertain, you pay more attention. When you're in danger, you're paying more attention. And there's this feeling of vividness that's involved here too. Okay, so then memory also plays a crucial epistemological role because memory information is not just a record of the past. It's a resource for making better predictions about the future as well. Because the agent does not remember just for sentimentality's sake. It's not just nostalgia. It remembers for a reason because the patterns of the past, if properly distilled, they're going to reduce the future surprise. But again, memory is slow and memory is expensive to write. And there has to be an epistemological trade-off where between the richness of memory and the cost of maintaining it, there's this balance, So an agent that remembers too much is going to drown in detail, but one that remembers too little is condemned pretty much to repeat its common mistakes all the time. So we have a way then to kind of frame in the concept of wisdom. Wisdom in this view is the act of compressing the past into a form that is maximally useful for future predictions. And at the same time, it's the optimal balance between forgetting and remembering. And remember, there's a thermodynamic considerations to reaching this balance. Finally, from an epistemological standpoint, A&D's epistemology is embodied and it's embedded. Because knowing is not something that happens inside just some kind of computer or some skull. Knowing it's a relation between an agent and its environment, which is mediated by the agent's sensory and effector surfaces. So the channel capacity is not just a property of the agent's brain, but it's a property of the whole sensoromotor loop. And predictive information is not about predicting arbitrary future states, but it's about predicting the consequences of the agent's own actions. Yeah, especially negentropically, the negentropic consequences. So knowledge is then it's action-oriented from the start. And the agent knows what it needs to know to act effectively. And its knowledge is it's constantly being tested, not by some kind of academic exam, but by the unforgiving tribunal of real-world consequences. And there are dissipation consequences if our knowledge is poor. So To know is to be able to steer, effectively, which can have ramifications if we don't. Okay, let's move to the concept of axiology, or what is the good. Axiology is the study of value, isn't it? It's what is good, what is bad, what should be sought after, what should be avoided. And A&D, though descriptive in its mathematical core, does carry some profound axiological implications if we think this through. First of all, it suggests that value is not some mysterious or some non-natural property that philosophers have to intuit or that philosophers have to impose from us upon us from some ivory tower, but rather value is an emergent feature of the very process of agency itself. What we mean is that to ask what is good for any agent is, in a deep sense, just to ask what conduces to the maintenance of and enhancement of its order. What contributes to good predictive power is value, and also what contributes to its capacity for counterfactual richness. So, what contributes to order, what contributes positively to predictive power and to counterfactual richness, these are valuable things. So we can begin with the most fundamental value, order itself. So in a universe that tends towards featureless equilibrium, order is the prerequisite for any other good. Because a thing must first be in a structured and persistent way before it can value anything else. And A&D framework suggests that the good for an agent is not merely to have order, but to be able to maintain order, and even more so to be able to increase order, or to enlarge this kind of island of structure that it maintains against the encroachment of an entropic sea. But, and this is crucial, the value of order is not absolute, because the framework's throughput law tells us that order is a dynamic balance between influx and dissipation. Now, too little order, the agent is going to dissolve into chaos. But what happens if you have too much order? Well, it becomes too rigid, it becomes too brittle, and it can't adapt. So the good is, therefore, a golden mean of order. It's a level of negentropy that is robust, but it's still flexible. It is stable, yet it's still open to change. This is profoundly Aristotelian, that insight. But we've taken and rendered it into physical terms, and that virtue lies in the right balance. And the right balance is a function of the agent's resources and the agent's environment. The second great value is predictive power. The capacity to see the future, even if it's very dimly, is incredibly high value. The A&D framework measures this through predictive information rates. And an agent that can predict well suffers fewer surprises, and it also wastes less energy on stupid or futile or unproductive actions. And it can also plan more effectively. Predictive power is a form of epistemic capital then, and just like any capital, it pays dividends in reduced dissipation and in enhanced survival. But also, like all capital, it is subject to diminishing returns. And the A&D framework suggests that agency saturates at a minimum of power availability and channel capacity. What I mean is you can't predict better than your sensors allow, nor than your agency budget permits. So the good is not an infinite predictive power. Good is adequate predictive power, tuned to the scale of the agent's world and the agent's practical needs. So a simple agent in a simple world needs only simple predictions. But a complex agent in a complex world needs a rich model. And so the value is not just sheer quantity, right? It's not sheer quantity of prediction, but the value is actually the fit between the predictive horizon and the agent's life. So it's not simple. But there is a third value we want to talk about, which is efficiency. Every bit of information, every joule of energy is costly. The agent that uses these resources wisely is better off than the one that wastes or squanders these resources. So the A&D framework makes this pretty explicit. The throughput of order depends on how well information and energy are integrated. So an agent that wastes power on irrelevant spectral modes, or an agent that fails to use its predictive information well for control, it's actually dissipating its own being. So then we have a definition of the good. It's elegance of operation. It's the art of achieving maximal order maintenance with minimal waste. And this is not just a practical virtue, but it's a deep axiological virtue. To be efficient is to honor the scarcity of existence, to make something precious from limited means. You know, life is, in this universe, is pretty rare. Agency is pretty rare. So it in itself is a value. So there's a fourth value. It's more subtle, but it is still quite important. It's this idea of counterfactual richness. Because an agent that can only follow a single script is not alive in any kind of axiological sense. There's no value there. The capacity to entertain alternatives, the capacity to feel the weight of what if. This is the basis of freedom. It's the basis of creativity. This ability to differentiate or to distinguish. The framework of A&D, we're measuring this basis through counterfactual divergence. Its axiological claim is that a life with greater divergence, with more genuine options, with more richer deliberation, is a more valuable life than one of just rote automation. And that's not to say that complexity is always good. I'm not saying that. Actually, the A&D warns that complexity does raise the cost and the resistance of agency. But what we are saying is that the value lies in the right level of complexity, a level of complexity that opens up meaningful choices without overwhelming the agent with a bunch of irrelevant noise. So the good life is one where we are neither trapped in some kind of rigid routine, and we're also not lost in chaos. But what we're doing is navigating in a space of real possibilities in a way that we can select one of maybe a multiple of negentropic paths and extract them from a multitude of entropic pathways. We also have talked about the value of spectral harmony, those internal rhythms of an agent. This is another value component in the axiology of agentic negentropic dynamics. Its neural oscillations, its metabolic cycles, its heartbeats. These are not just background noise. These are temporal architecture of agency. And when these rhythms are in balance, the agent operates more smoothly. And when they're dissonant, the agent pays a higher housekeeping cost, just dissipating its energy just to keep itself from flying apart. Right? So the good, then, is going to be a kind of temporal health. The resonance between the agent's internal frequencies and the demands of its environment should be in sync. And again, this is a profoundly musical conception of value. Again, back to the mathematics of Kuromoto. And we're saying that a well-lived life has rhythm, it has syncopation, and has harmony in it, internally and externally. And so finally, this is the most speculative axiological claim that A&D makes. It's the operational hypothesis of phenomenal intensity. So what phenomenal intensity does is it offers an axiological account of consciousness itself, that what it feels like or what it's like to experience the qualia of consciousness. And a phenomenal intensity suggests that the vividness of experience, this feeling of being alive in a moment, is proportional to the rate at which the agent is reading its own uncertainty, the negative derivative of its belief entropy. And that, weighted by its interceptive state and the power of its internal rhythms. So, if this hypothesis holds, and it is a testable, falsifiable hypothesis mathematically, then value is not just about survival and prediction, but it's about the quality of your experience as well. A life that is rich in learning, rich in meaningful choice, rich in its resonant internal states, it's not just more effective, it's more intense. It's more fully lived. And this is an axiology that grounds the value of consciousness not in some kind of ethereal mystery, but in some measurable processes. The rate of information gain, the depth of counterfactual exploitation or exploration, and the power of your inner harmony, the beauty of your inner song of your life. It's a well-lived and life that you're sucking the juice out of your experience. And this goes back as an answer again to David Chalmers' hard question of consciousness, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, we're going to get into an interesting discussion on the metaphysics, which is the deep structure of agentic reality. Because metaphysics asks the deepest questions. What is causation? What is time? Is the universe determined or is it open? How does matter relate to mind? Right? The metaphysics problem. So, agentic negentropic dynamics, though it is operational in its expression, it does rest on a rich and pretty radical metaphysical vision here. So let's talk about causation first. Because in the classical view, causation is a simple chain, right? A pushes B, B pushes C, C pushes D. But A and D suggest something more subtle. Causation in agentive systems is looping and prediction. An agent's action is caused not just by its present state, but by its prediction of the future. What we mean is that the agent is moving now because it anticipates that moving is going to lead to a better ordered state later. So this is final causation. It's different. It's causation directed toward a goal. This is rehabilitated in physical terms, but it's not mysterious. The goal is not some kind of ghostly intention. The goal is a gradient in a free energy landscape. It's a tendency towards states that are less surprising and more sustainable. So the agent is a region of space-time where the arrow of causation loops back on itself, where the future pulls the present as much as the past pushes the present. So the metaphysics of agency here, causation, is interesting. Now this leads to the metaphysics of time, just naturally. And A and D posits both objective time, like the universal river of time, and it also posits subjective time, the agent's own clock rate. This duality actually challenges the Newtonian picture of time as some kind of uniform container. Subjective time is not an illusion in this framework. It's a real physical quality. It's the rate at which an agent processes its own existence. So when you're bored, the world seems to slow down and kind of time crawls. But when you're terrified, it seems to go really fast. What A and D says is that this is not just an appearance, it's not just a feeling, but it's a measurable feature of your internal dynamics. Because your clock is going to speed up when prediction errors are high. Your heart rate goes faster, your breathing rate increases, right? When arousal is intense, you speed up. The entire metabolic cost of processing is increasing, and actually your agentic loop from beginning to end is shorter. Like a fly, it has a very short processing loop, where a turtle has a pretty long one, and a fly lives a couple of weeks, but a turtle lives 100 years. So we're suggesting that time is relational and time is agentic. This is not a backdrop against which agency plays out. What it is it's a dimension of agency itself. It's stretched and compressed by the very processes that constitute agency itself. And the deep metaphysical implications of this is that time's passage is not uniform, but it's generated from the informational and energetic activity of the agent. There is a mortality table to that too. I mean, it is true that if your heart beats faster, you die sooner. Okay? The universe obviously has its own relentless clock, but agents also live by their own tempos, and agentic tempos are just as real as atomic oscillations. Anything that is universally stable is a real temporal phenomena, but so are the temporal phenomenon of your own felt time. Okay, another metaphysical insight here is this problem of emergence in levels. The A&D framework explicitly recognizes multiple timescales because there's the fast dynamics of perception and action, and then there's medium dynamics of belief updating, and then there's the slow dynamics of memory and parameter changes, the adiabatic changes of memory. Now, this is a metaphysics of stratification. And in that metaphysics, reality is organized into layers that are relatively autonomous, but they're at the same time mutually influencing. Because the fast layers can't see the slow ones directly, but they experience them as stable background conditions. And on the other hand, the slow layers are shaped by the cumulative statistics of the fast layers. And this is how wisdom emerges, not as a sudden revelation, but as the slow consolidation of experiences into parameters that guide future actions. So the agent is not a single unified thing. The agent is a loose assemblage of processes that are all operating at different speeds, and it's the unity. The unity of this is an achievement. It's not given. It's not just a given. And so this actually resonates with both, if you know anything about Buddhist metaphysics, that the self is a fleeting aggregation, but also it resonates with the contemporary processes philosophy, where being is becoming and becoming is layered. That's modern process philosophy, if you've read up on that. But we also have a new metaphysics for the mind-body problem here, a new take on the mind-body problem anyway. We're not reducing mind to matter, and we're not treating mind and matter as mind and body as separate substances. What we're doing is positing an identity through a process. This is saying that mental states are informational states, and informational states are physical configurations. So belief is a probability distribution, yes, but that distribution is written into the very structure of the agent. It's written into the weights of its synapses, or the parameters of its circuits. So the free energy principle that underpins A&D's variational dynamics is actually a bridge. It's an isomorphic bridge between information and energy and beliefs. The free energy principle says that the same principle that governs self-organization of physical systems, like minimize surprise, it also governs the updating of beliefs. Mind is not a ghost in the machine. Mind is the informational aspect of a self-organizing physical process. So to think is to configure matter in a certain way, and to configure matter in a certain way is to think. So the mystery actually dissolves not into reduction, but into a dual aspect, monism. Because there's one process and there's two descriptions. There's a physical and an informational description of the same process. So what about free will then? A&D suggests that the traditional debate between determinism and indeterminism is a red herring. It kind of misses the point. An agent is determined in the sense that its dynamics are governed by physical laws and by its own parameters. Can't escape that. But an agent is free in the sense that its actions are guided by its own internal models, its own predictions, and its own counterfactual explorations. So the key here is the counterfactual divergence. An agent is free to the extent that it can meaningfully differentiate between different policies, different futures, different selves, different versions of itself. So this is not a libertarian free will we're talking about. This is, it's not the will of uncaused cause. This is a compatibilist free will that's grounded in the agent's capacity for self-modeling and self-control. Okay? You're free because you can ask, what if? And because your answer to that question shapes your own actions. The A&D framework even suggests that this capacity can be measured algorithmically, that freedom has a physical signature in the divergence between predictive distributions. So free will here has handles on it, in a sense. Okay, finally, there is the metaphysics of possibility. A&D's belief densities and A&D's counterfactual divergences, they suggest that there is a vast space of possibilities that are not actual, but are physically real in the sense that they do influence the agent. The agent's world is not just what it is, but what it could be. And the space of could be is encoded in the very structure of the agent. So this is a modal realism kind of. It's not an extravagant claim that all possible worlds exist. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that for an agent, possibilities are causally efficacious. They shape predictions. They guide actions. They constitute the space of deliberation that the agent can operate within. Now, the realm of the possible is not a ghostly realm anymore. Then, it's a computational and informational space that is as real as the agent's body is real. So again, when we come to metaphysics, the structure of reality, we've got some interesting contributions from agentic negentropic dynamics. We're going to move now into a discussion of the practical implications of A&D, because a philosophy is going to be only as valuable as the light that it can shed on the lived experience and the practical problems of those to whom it pertains. And so A&D as a framework, for all of it, what might seem to be abstraction, it does have concrete implications for how we might design artificial agents, first of all, how we might understand biological agents, and how we can live good lives even. It's interesting. So let's take a couple of those in turn. Let's talk about designing artificial agents. Because the first and most obvious application is engineering of autonomous systems, like robots or AI, self-driving cars, these kind of control systems. And so A&D tells us that agency is not primarily about algorithms, but it's primarily about thermodynamics and about information budgets. So a robot that has plenty of computational power but has limited energy supply, it's going to fail when its power runs out. Or an AI that has vast data but a narrow channel capacity is going to drown in its own noise. These are the lessons we learn from agentic negentropic dynamic. The practical design principle then is budget consciousness. That's the design principle. Every design decision has to be weighted against its cost in joules and its cost in bits. So the framework of A&D suggests to us that we should design agents that have explicit order maintenance goals. Not just task completion goals, but goals toward maintaining their order. For example, a self-driving car should not only get you to its destination, but it should maintain a stable internal model of the world. It should keep its uncertainty bounded, and it should manage its own energy reserves well. It should have a subjective time clock that speeds up in emergencies and that slows down during calm. And that would allow it to allocate processing power where it's needed. And it should also have some spectral housekeeping monitor that ensures its internal rhythms are not burning power uselessly. So basically, we should not just build smart machines, but we should build wise machines. Machines that understand the thermodynamics of their own existence. Okay, other practical implications. What about biological agency? A&D offers a new lens on life. For example, a bacterium is an agent that maintains chemical order using predictive chemotaxis. A brain is an agent that maintains neural order using predictive coding. A&D's housekeeping dissipation term suggests that much of the brain's enormous energy budget is not for thinking, in the narrow sense, but for maintaining the delicate spectral coordination of its rhythms. It's very rhythmic, and it spends a lot of energy maintaining its coordination, right? Coherence and synchronicity. So if you think of that then, and we consider disorders like epilepsy or schizophrenia, right? These might be understood as spectral pathologies, where the internal modes become dissonant, they can cost too much power, they can collapse predictive capacity. And think of mental health from this perspective, for example. It's not just the absence of bad thoughts. but it's the optimal thermodynamic and informational state of the whole agent. So depression then, mightn't it be a state of low subjective time where the clock runs so slowly that predictive information can't be integrated? And that would lead to a collapse of order. Or anxiety might be a state of excessively high subjective time where the clock races, it burns through power and channel capacity, and then it leaves the agent exhausted, unable to maintain coherent belief. So treatment would be what? The treatment would aim not just in changing beliefs, it would aim at recalibrating the entire agentive system, its energy budget, its clock rate, its spectral harmony. Perhaps therapeutics for mental health could be more expansive through the lens of agentic negentropic dynamics. Think of the practical implications in the area of personal development and self-understanding. Think that, because A&D also speaks to human flourishing, doesn't it? Each of us is an agent with a finite power budget. We have limited channel capacity, and we have a subjective clock that speeds and slows. Okay, so what does it mean to live well then, from an A&D perspective? Well, we want to manage those resources wisely, don't we? Because the person who takes on too many commitments, for example, who tries to process too much information, who lives in a constant state of high arousal, what are they doing? They're burning through their negentropy too fast. They're like an engine running in the red all the time. Eventually something's going to break. So the wise person, by contrast, it cultivates order at the right level. It's not so rigid as to be brittle. It's not so loose as to be chaotic. Effective agents manage our spectral modes. We sleep regularly. We're going to exercise to entrain our metabolic rhythms. We're going to engage in practices like, R&R, so that we can reduce dissonant internal noise, for example. We're going to be introspective and quiet at times. And then also a wise agent is going to respect their own channel capacity and focus attention on what matters. So prioritization, right? We're going to filter noise. We don't multitask beyond our limits. And we understand that memory is expensive. So what we want to do is start externalizing where possible. We write things down. We free up internal resources for deeper learning and externalize the costly memory. What else do? We nurture our counterfactual capacity, because we practice imagining things. We daydream. We consider alternatives. We avoid being trapped in our routines. This is the source of freedom and creativity in our lives. So basically, the framework A&D, it suggests, we can go farther with that, but it suggests that self-care is system maintenance and ethics is optimal resource allocation. What about education and learning? What are the implications of A&D here? Well, we're reconceiving learning, aren't we? Not as a passive absorption of facts. Learning is more like active predictive optimization. So a good education is one that maximizes the student's predictive information gain, while at the same time respecting their power and channel constraints. What this means is that teaching should be neither too easy nor too hard. Right? I always say that if your student is not laughing at all, they're not learning, but if they're laughing too much, they're not learning. If the material is completely predictable, no information is gained. But if it's completely unpredictable, the student's belief system can't integrate it, and it's just a bunch of noise. So the optimal learning zone, from an A&D perspective, is one that is that of productive surprise. The prediction errors are just large enough to drive useful belief updates, but they're not so large as to overwhelm the system. Are you familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development? Yeah, it's a physical basis for Vygotsky. But the framework also suggests that sleep and consolidation are not rest only. These are essential memory housekeeping. Sleep and consolidation. The slow variables of memory are updated during sleep, and the day's predictive work is integrated into the stable substrate of long-term knowledge. So what does that mean? Pulling all-nighters is not productive. It's like trying to build a house. It's like trying to build the second story of your house before the mortar of the first story has solidified. You need your sleep in an education space. Agentic Negentropics helps you to think that through. We could also apply A&D to social and institutional design, because the framework, it does extend to multi-agent systems. So a society is actually a collection of agents whose individual order maintenance efforts are coupled together. That means a well-designed institution is going to minimize the co-interferential inference and maximize cooperative exchange. So, for example, a market is a mechanism for agents to exchange information and resources. And it's supposed to be in a way that allows each to maintain its order more efficiently. Another example, a well-functioning democracy is a system that's for collective counterfactual deliberation, and it allows the group to explore alternative policies, to select those that best maintain the collective order, right? The rule of law, the health of the populace, the sustainability of the environment. Or a poorly designed institution, on the other hand, is going to create dissipative coupling. And it forces agents to waste energy on conflict, misinformation, bureaucratic noise. And A&D provides a way to evaluate institutions. Are they thermodynamically and informationally efficient? Do they help agents maintain order, or do they accelerate entropy? Now, the final point about the practical implementations are just based on consciousness as a phenomenological experience, a phenomenal experience. The optional hypothesis of phenomenal intensity. This is rather speculative, but it does suggest a practical research program. Can we measure the richness of experience? Can we build agents that not only act but feel? Are there practical implications to this? Well, at the far reaches, it might sound silly, but if the hypothesis is correct, we might decide that we have a duty to ensure artificial agents are not subjected to pointless suffering. Again, it sounds silly, but if you turn that around, it's actually a look in the mirror about how we treat each other too. Think about it from a robot's perspective. If the robot's phenomenal intensity scales with information gain and housekeeping cost, that means if its experience becomes more intense with too much information and too much energy cost, then forcing it to process a bunch of meaningful noise at high power is actually a form of cruelty. It sounds fanciful, it sounds silly, but the point here is not to wander off into absurdity, but to just point out that A&D actually requests that we take the question seriously. If consciousness is a physical process tied to information and energy, then consciousness can in principle be measured, and its moral status has to be considered. Again, I'm not recommending that we fly off into absurdities here. What I'm saying is that agentic negentropic dynamics is a mirror. When I look at the philosophy, the theory, I have to ask myself, how do I pressure my students? How do I pressure my workers? How do I pressure myself? Am I being cruel? Or am I pacing things in a way that respects the energy and the channel constraints? All right, so there are a lot of practical implications. And again, the philosophy is only as valuable as the insights it can give into the real world, the real meaningful world that we live in. In way of conclusion, formal agency framework, this agentic negentropic dynamics, it's not just a set of equations. It's an actual vision of what it means to exist in a structured, striving, knowing, and valuing being in a universe that would otherwise just wash us clean of all structure. It tells us that to be an agent is to be like a candle flame in the wind. It's shaping the air even as the air tries to blow you out. It tells us that thought is physical, that memory is costly, that time is alive, and that complexity is a continuous transformation of the very rules by which we play. So A&D offers a new way to think about illness and health, a new way to think about design and ethics, about the quiet wisdom and slow memory, about the sharp intensity of the present moment, and how to get real quality out of our lives. And it does this while still remaining really strongly tied to the hard ground of physical law. It reminds us that even our highest abstractions are paid for in the coin of energy and dissipated as heat. So in the end, A&D suggests that philosophy and physics are not separate enterprises, but they're two ways of describing the same struggle. What's that struggle? It's the struggle to be, the struggle to know, the struggle to mean something in a world that tends towards dissipation.